Hey, Psych 101 students, just wanted to go over the muddy points for the psychological disorders chapter. Um, Again, a lot of people, pretty clear with a lot of stuff, but there were some questions just trying to get a better grasp of a couple of the disorders. Others actually were just, sort of more advancing questions in terms of, just some just really kind of relevant, but not necessarily content specific questions. So let's go over these. So the first one that I want to talk about was the differentiation between neurotic and psychotic and how it is observed in the world. So first off, I want to say that neurotic and psychotic is an old way of separating disorders. So if you were looking 100 years ago, psychologists would say basically, you can almost think of it as like there were two disorders. You were either neurotic or you were psychotic. And the difference is that psychotic is a break from reality. So these were people who didn't seem to be behaving or thinking or acting in reality. They seemed very irrational and so on. In a lot of ways, probably the most common disorder that probably would fall under that would be something like paranoid schizophrenia. And then on the other end, it was neurotic. And neurotic, probably the closest thing we have in our current disorders to what neurotic is just anxiety disorder, probably a generalized anxiety disorder. Now, I also want to put some of this in the context of the times and the sexism that existed then. Most of the psychologists were male, and they're often working with females as clients or patients. And so there was this, like hysteria was an actual concern, and that really is just probably in terms of if we take the context of gender into account, a lot of that's just sort of like how a male would describe a female, because they're so emotional or whatever, they're hysterical. So they turned it into a disorder. So we always want to do that when we think about the way we create psychological disorders. It's often going to be a reflection of our society and what we consider normal, but also what we consider good behavior or appropriate behavior. And that's going to very much depend on who's the one making that decision. So if all the psychologists are male, there are probably going to be certain disorders that would be considered wrong, or they're disorders. But that if you asked females, they would say, no, there's nothing wrong with that. So absolutely in our current DSM, there are disorders in there that are going to be, that we'll look back in 50 years and say, God, how did we ever think that was a disorder? And that's just, again, because there's all these contextual factors going on. So think of neurotic then as this really sort of anxious, worrying a lot. And so that a person who's more neurotic is functioning for the most part, but they're just really caught up in their anxiety and they're struggling and so on. Whereas somebody who's psychotic is really just, they're not in reality. So it's not an excessive worry. It is like they're seeing things or they're hearing things and so on. So that was sort of an early distinction. And then we've clearly gotten a lot more precise in our distinctions. So that's what I would say in terms of that one. Next one, I understand historically people associated psychological disorders with the supernatural. I'm curious how much influence this had on old tales of monsters, witches, and demons. I love that question. Yeah, it's probably, it is. If we don't understand something, I think as humans, we try to come up with an explanation for it, and we create stories. And so sometimes it's easy to just, well, I don't understand why this bad stuff is happening. There must be monsters, or there must be witches who have cursed me, or whatever. And so there is often this other, often supernatural explanation, because all of the natural things that we understand don't really explain what's going on. So it must be something supernatural, bigger than the natural or tangible world. So I think they're very much related. So if I see somebody's behavior and I don't understand it, then yeah, that person is now we would say, oh, clearly they have schizophrenia. They're having a psychotic break. There's some dopamine issues in their brain. And so they're seeing and hearing things that aren't real. But if you don't understand neurons and dopamine, neurotransmitters, etc., and how the brain works, then yeah, it's probably makes reasonable sense to say, oh, well, they must be possessed by a demon or something like that. So it's a great question. Yeah. So I think it's just what we do as humans is we try to explain things. And when we don't have good, obvious, rational answers based on tangible things, we'll come up with other explanations. And that's where all our, I think a lot of our stories come from. I also think it's worth pointing out that there are still plenty of societies today that believe that what we in the US would consider our psychological disorders, they would say are demonic possession and things like that. Tend to be more third world countries, but they also tend to be countries that just have maybe more of a societal belief in the supernatural. And that will come up a little bit in a bit here when we talk about schizophrenia. Next one, seasonal affective disorder is very interesting to me. I want to understand better the part about people who are affected more in the winter or with lack of sunlight. You mentioned that treatment can be done with artificial light. Does the reduction of vitamin D absorption in wintertime play a part in this disorder? Are there any physical aspects, or is it only psychological, as in just bummed out and missing warmth and sunshine that applies? So, great question. Okay, so what I would say is, first off, are there more physical symptoms, or rather than just, sort of more of the psychological? Yeah, mostly the physical symptoms are the physical symptoms we see with depression. So lack of energy, changes in sleep, changes in appetite. So just remember that depression isn't all mood. And again, there are a number of symptoms, and you don't have to hit all of them to be diagnosed with depression. And I think I mentioned in the video, but if I didn't, there is, there are some cultural differences in terms of how people experience depression. So some people, and even just like in the US, I see a difference between often, this is a generalization, but often males and females in many cases can experience depression differently. Some people, mostly males, tend to experience more the physical side of depression. They have a hard time, their memory's struggling, they're sleeping more, they have low energy, their appetite, they eat too much or too little, and so on. So they have often those physical symptoms. Females, on the other hand, tend to have more the mood, or what might be described as the psychological symptoms, feeling bummed, hopelessness, helplessness, things like that. That's probably due to the context of our culture, and specifically around gender, is that males are not supposed to be emotional, so they may just kind of hide those emotional responses. And so they're more likely to notice and report the physical symptoms. So there can be physical symptoms. I'm not sure if you were asking about other physical symptoms, like fatigue is part of it, but that's also part of depression. But you might have been getting at something with the vitamin D comment, which I think is really, really awesome question, because so we know that part of what our bodies do is use sunlight to process vitamin D. And vitamin D is a very important nutrient for our body. And the more sunlight we get, the more vitamin D we're processing. And so is that associated with seasonal affective disorder? And there may be, it's a great question, and people have looked at it. I don't think we're necessarily to an answer yet. But I have seen studies where they did seem to find that vitamin D as a treatment may have helped, or at least groups that get better, their seasonal affective disorder gets better, they see their amount of vitamin D in their system goes up. So, there's a lot to explore there, and could be really interesting to kind of see where that ends up. So I think that was a really good question, and a kind of applying some interesting things. And for those of you who don't know, that maybe you probably didn't know that we process vitamin D through sunlight, and that's why there's different skin colors. That as humans migrated north away from the equator mostly, but sometimes south away from the equator, over thousands of years, our skin got lighter and lighter. So those groups that were farther from the equator had lighter skin. And that's because of the UV rays that were ultraviolet rays that are coming in from the sun. That's what our bodies use to synthesize and create vitamin D. But people who live near the equator get lots of sun because they're closer. There's more sun, and the angle of the sun is more direct. And so they tend to have darker skin because that darker skin actually reflects a lot of the UV rays because it's unhealthy for your skin. And so that can be a problem. But as humans migrated farther north and south away from the equator, we got less sunlight, less direct sunlight, and in some times of the year, just less sunlight in general. And thus, we evolved. The people who would live longer and be healthier were ones that had lighter skin because we don't want to reflect as much of the UV rays away. We need to have some of it being let through to process and help us synthesize vitamin D. And so that's why you see different skin colors now. The skin color was just simply adaptations to living at different amounts of sun. So lighter skin tends to be better in farther northern latitudes, darker skin closer to the equator, where there's more sun. So just a side note there. Next questions have to do with schizophrenia. So the only thing I'm trying to wrap my head around and understand is schizophrenia. In order to be considered schizophrenic, do you have to show all the symptoms like hallucination, delusions, disorganized thinking, disorganized and abnormal behavior, motor behavior, or just some of them are also their different levels of diagnosis? I feel like disorganized thinking happens a lot in the day-to-day and is a common thing. Yeah. So this is one of those, first, I just want to approach this with the idea that you always want to be careful is that all disorders are based on normal behaviors. So yes, we all have disorganized thinking. Where it becomes a disorder is that it's an extreme amount. You just, like, we all can do it, but some people are doing it all the time. They really struggle to not have disorganized thinking. So be careful, yeah, because you should be able to recognize any symptoms you've probably experienced. Just remember, it's how often you experience it, how severe is it, and so on. So that's one thing I would say. The other part is just in general around diagnosing, like using the DSM, is you don't usually have to meet all of the symptoms. Each diagnosis is different, and they're often like, you need to meet all 3 of these plus 2 of the following 5, or you need to meet 4 of the following 10, or they all have different ways to diagnose. So with schizophrenia, you probably don't need to meet every single one. There might be certain combinations. And then the other piece is that absolutely there are lots of different versions of schizophrenia. Again, we just did sort of a superficial approach to it. If you're really interested in this stuff, definitely check out, I think for at SCC, it's called Abnormal Psychology. That will go in, it's a semester long, or, it's a full class on just psychological disorders. And so they'll go in and there's, I don't know, maybe a dozen or more different versions of schizophrenia. And we just touched on a couple of them, the paranoid schizophrenia and the disorganized, and then the catatonic. Those are some common ones. But there's schizotypal, there's all these different types. So yes, there are different versions of that. And then somebody also asked related to schizophrenia. I really struggle with schizophrenia less, and I guess it was just the genetic part of it. I was always under the impression that resulted from drugs and not genetic, so it's a little bit confusing relearning it under different contexts. Yeah, I think that for many people, maybe they do believe or have heard that schizophrenia results from too much drugs. It doesn't. It is a psychological disorder. Now, some people can have so a big part of schizophrenia is a psychotic component. Psychotic, again, break from reality. So again, friendly reminder, schizophrenia is not split personality. Okay, because people understand that the word schizo is like a split. But here, what the split is referring to is not split personalities. It's a split from reality. Here's reality, and here's where you are. You are separate from reality. You are hearing voices and seeing things that are not there. That's not reality. And so that is a common piece. Now, that psychotic experience can be caused by drugs. A lot of like cocaine is one where sometimes people who use cocaine or have bad trips with those, they can have psychotic experiences. where they're hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there. So yes, it can be drug related, but for many people it is actually, there seems to be some kind of genetic components to it. And yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a fascinating disorder, and my personal experience with clients that I've worked with, these were really, really intelligent people. But they would just sometimes you could almost, the first person I worked with who had schizophrenia was a 40-year-old mother who late in her life. She was like 40 when she finally had like a psychotic break, ended up in the hospital. I was testing her and she was really nice, really sweet. And I was just talking to her and asking her questions. And every once in a while she'd just sort of drift off and look off to the side. And I just let her be. And just 10 seconds later, she'd come back and say, "I'm sorry, what was the question again?" And then I'd ask her, I'd say, what happened there? And she said, "Oh, I was just hearing voices." And it's just this thing that happens. And so it's, we again look at it as too much dopamine. And again, remember, your brain is just a bunch of neurons firing in different patterns. And if something gets a little bit off in there, yeah, you can hear things that aren't there. You can see things that aren't there. It doesn't take much for that to happen. It's just pretty rare. Our brains amazingly work pretty well most of the time, given the billions of neurons firing that are happening at any given moment. So that was schizophrenia. Next topic is antisocial personality disorder. I didn't get antisocial personality disorder. Isn't that just people being assholes? It feels more like how they were nurtured rather than what's wrong with them biologically. Yeah, so part of that might be when the layperson's use of the word antisocial versus a licensed psychologist's version of antisocial. When we say, "Oh, that person's being antisocial," maybe in the layperson's term, that's just somebody being an asshole. They're not very social. They're kind of jerks to other people. Yeah, that's one thing. That is just maybe antisocial behavior. But when it's a disorder, it is specifically antisocial personality disorder, then think of them almost as a professional asshole. It might be the way to think of it. Meaning just like this is how they are in like all their interactions, and there's something to it there, and there's probably a biological component to it, but these people are really they have little to no conscience. They really do not care how their behaviors impact anyone else. I probably mentioned in the lecture video that there is a constellation of personality disorders called cluster B, and there's usually three that are kind of in there, but two of them are narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. And you can see how those are actually kind of closely linked if you just think of it as all I care about is me. Now, somebody who's narcissistic really just loves themselves, but also really that's all they care about. They just want to feel good about themselves. So other people are only there to be used to make them feel good about themselves. That's all they're there for. But somebody who's antisocial personality disorder also doesn't really care about other people at all. They also don't think like, I don't really care about what you think. But theirs is more based on a lack of conscience in a way. They just don't care about other people. But so some people often have both of those together. And then there's a third one that I forget what makes up the cluster B. But my point being that there is sort of this weird, it is just a self-orientation that is just so excessive. Now, all of us can be selfish or self-focused or self-centered at times, but most of us have a conscience and that we feel bad when we do something that hurts somebody else. But somebody with antisocial personality disorder just doesn't. It's like they have an inability to feel that. And so it's a very different thing. Now, there are different levels of this. So some people are really antisocial personality disorder, and some people maybe a little bit more mildly so. I had a student couple, maybe years, I guess probably 2 years ago, who approached me after class and said, "Yeah, I've been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and I'm really working on it," and things like that. And so it is, it's something that people have, and it doesn't have to be as I mean, some of the people, the most awful people in history, have antisocial personality disorder. And sadly, they're often in positions of power too. Because, what makes for a successful politician, what makes for a successful business owner, things like that, are often not caring about other people and just caring about yourself. So you often see that cluster B where they're narcissistic and they're antisocial personality disorder. That does not mean that all politicians are. But I think you can go through history and look at lots of high-level politicians and lots of CEOs and things like that, and you can just see that they really don't care much about other people. It's about their own power and about themselves most of the time. But then there's lots of CEOs and politicians who are just really good people who are trying to do good things. So that was one thing with regard to antisocial personality disorder. And then this one was, what is muddiest to me is the difference outline between men and women when it comes to antisocial personality disorder. Hard to believe these behaviors have a correlation between both gender and the specific disorder. Now, I would say one thing that we might want to think about here too is that is that context again. So sometimes there's a cultural context that changes how disorders look. So like when I mentioned earlier in this video that sometimes males and females, but people in general sometimes experience depression more by the physical symptoms and other more by the psychological or mood-based symptoms. That is partly can be cultural, that what you're supposed to do according to your culture. So if males are not supposed to be emotional, they push those down and they just don't do that, but they can still get depressed, but it'll come out more in these physical ways. So it's possible that many women are not getting diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder because the symptoms that are built in right now into the DSM might be skewed more towards males because those males are more noticeable, and then that's how the diagnosis got built. So it's possible. We don't, the one thing to recognize is that sometimes, when we have these disorders, they're a little bit off. So I don't know how much you know about diagnosing heart attacks, but the diagnosis for heart attacks is certain things happen, right? And the diagnosis for heart attacks was completely based on males. And so many females have had heart attacks and for years were not getting diagnosed with having heart attacks because the symptomology was based on males. And so now doctors are getting better trained to look for this set of symptoms in males, but this set of symptoms in females, because they may just come out differently, but it's still a heart attack. So it's possible that that's going on with schizophrenia. It's also, possible that there is this, some differences biologically that may be affecting it. So again, like most of science, time will tell. We'll get closer and closer to the answer. And as you see, like with COVID, the thing with COVID in science is that the science is changing because we're still learning about COVID. We don't know. We're getting data. Like right now, life is an experiment. The entire world is under an experiment of how does COVID play out. We don't know. So the scientists and the epidemiologists are changing their suggestions and their understanding on a day-to-day basis because new evidence is coming in and they're adjusting to that. And that's exactly what we want them to do. If we treated COVID like it was when it was the first version of it, before it started mutating, and if we just said, okay, this is how we're going to behave now from now on, we would just be completely off because now with the new variants, it's completely changed. We needed to adapt to the increased susceptibility, like the transmission rate for like the Delta variant is much higher. And thus that's why we're probably going to have to go back to wearing masks again. Not because scientists and epidemiologists are stupid, it's because they are adapting and science is always changing, adapting and evolving and getting closer and closer to the truth. But they're always open to change. They're always open to new evidence. That's kind of the beauty of science. Next one. Dopamine seems really important to mental stability. I was surprised to see that an overabundance of dopamine can be found in diagnosed schizophrenia cases and also cases of ADHD. Seems to be an insufficient amount of dopamine. I'm curious to know how to keep dopamine levels even, and also if there are ways to change the size of different parts of the brain that moderate personalities. Great question. That's one of these cool. I love that you guys are going to some of these advanced questions, like you're taking the information and saying, well, where does this go? That's awesome. That's great thinking. In terms of that, it's hard to know because some people are just going to be programmed or wired in such a way where they just produce less dopamine. Some people produce more. And some of that is just genetic. It's kind of built in. But we also know with epigenetics, there are sometimes life experiences that can trigger those experiences or not. So let's say, for instance, that you have the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, excessive dopamine, right? So you might have more dopamine in your system. Your system, for whatever reason, creates excess dopamine. But you may never experience schizophrenia if your life doesn't have a lot of stresses. You have enough money maybe to meet your needs. Nothing super, super traumatic tends to happen to you. You might be fine. And that trigger never switches. And, so you never really experience a psychotic episode. But if you did have a super traumatic event, or, you're constantly living in poverty and struggling with this, or you don't have the right nutrition or whatever, then that excessive level of dopamine might just start to increase, and it might trigger it, and boom, now you're having psychotic experiences. So there's always, there's possibilities where there's probably a range that each of us is set up with based on our genetics of how much dopamine we're going to have. And then within that range, where we end up within that range is going to be based on our life experiences, trauma and finances, etc., stresses. And so so some people are down here, some people are up here with their range, some people have bigger ranges, some people have smaller ranges. That's probably how I'd think about it. Can you change it? Yes, life experiences can affect that, but also the question was, can we change the areas of our brain that affect personality? Well, we can change our brain. Our brain is always constantly growing. We talk about neuroplasticity, is that our neurons are always kind of growing and connecting to each other. And so, yes, we can build up areas of the brain through practice. And so I would argue that I think one of the things that psychotherapy does for people is it helps them practice the neural pathways that they need to change out of a unhealthy pattern of behavior into a more healthy, beneficial pattern of behavior. And through practicing doing that, meeting with a therapist who's helping you, think different ways, and also just be able to talk about it and all these different things, that helps start to rewire your brain and strengthen. I like to think of the brain as a muscle. The more you use certain neurons, the bigger and stronger they get. Basically what's happened is that they're just getting bushier, meaning they're more connected to other neurons. And you can kind of rewire the wiring in your brain. And so I definitely think that there is that ability to do that. And it just takes practice and kind of a concentrated effort. And that's where having something where you're making those changes can be so helpful. So psychotherapy is part of that. Sometimes for some people, it's just reading self-help books and just kind of practicing what they're reading. I think of like addicts and like the 12 steps programs, like AA. Alcoholics Anonymous is super effective, and it must do something because it definitely helps many, many, many people. So there's lots of different ways. So yeah, I absolutely think you can rewire your brain, but it takes practice, and it's not something like you can take a pill or you can just suddenly snap your finger and everything changes. It's a lifestyle change, and that's often what makes it so difficult. But that's where you sometimes need outside help. Sometimes people have their own ability to do that, but many people don't. And that's where I've had to seek therapy at times, just because if you're left to myself, sometimes just keep doing what I'm doing is often the easiest. So sometimes I just need to get kind of out of myself, talk to a therapist, and it's like a maintenance for my car. It's kind of the same thing. It's maintenance for my brain. Let's see. Oh, this one. Nothing. Everything seems explained. Thank you. I do have one question though. I was curious how people with disorders like schizophrenia and certain personality disorders are able to have close relationships. Does it depend on the severity? It seems like it would be difficult to maintain a good relationship with those who suffer from certain mental illnesses. Great question. Again, I love these questions. Yeah, it can be hard and can be done. That's sort of my answer. That student who I mentioned had antisocial personality disorder and sought me out after class, said I had antisocial personality disorder. And her comment was, it's like, I can have relationships. It's not easy, but I can, and I'm really working on it, and I see a therapist and so on. And so absolutely. Is it easy? No. And it sort of depends. And yes, I think in terms of that question, probably depends a bit on severity, but also, somebody working on it, somebody making effort. And then, so if you've got somebody who's, let's say, a narcissist, has narcissistic personality disorder, and you're in a relationship with them, and they're not going to acknowledge that they have it, they may not even know they have it, that can be a really tough relationship to be in. I had a student years ago who, she came up to me after class and said, I think I'm in a relationship with somebody with narcissism. And she went on to describe this person and their behavior. And I was like, okay, maybe. I never like to diagnose people that, I'm not actually officially meeting and so on. But I was like, yeah, I could see where you could see that. And then I ran into her. Maybe she took another of my classes a couple years later, and she's like, yeah, remember that person that I told you that I was dating, that I was kind of wondering if they're a narcissist? She's like, yeah, they turned out to be antisocial personality disorder. And they went on and told me some different things. And it's like, some people might wonder, how do you get in a relationship with somebody like that? Well, somebody who's antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic can be really fun. These are people who are so full of themselves, but they have a super confidence. And we, as humans, tend to love people who are confident. They can take over a room, and we can be really enamored of that. But then when it comes to having a good relationship where there's a give and take, none of that's going to happen in many cases, or it's very hard for that to happen. And so, but if that person is acknowledging that they have this disorder and they're trying to work on it, it is definitely possible to have relationships, and many people have. And the last couple questions here, the only question I have is if there's a requirement on people in this field to maintain their education on different disorders. Absolutely. So counselors, psychologists, therapists, whatever you want to call them, they have what are called continuing education credits. So every couple years, I'm not sure exactly if it's every 2 years, every 3 years, they have to get they have to essentially take a certain number of workshops or classes, and then they're often going to have certain topics that they have to cover. So some of it's going to be, on certain disorders, some of it's going to be on ethics, some of it's going to be on cultural inclusivity and equity and inclusion, etc. So there's some different training that you're just kind of always constantly honing your skills and keeping up to date with the latest and so on. So that is a requirement for many professional fields like counseling and being a therapist, to being a doctor and so on. There's what we call continuing education, and it's an expectation and it's a requirement. So in order to maintain your license, you have to show the licensing board every few years, these are the classes, and they're all like official, like you get stamped for different things and you have to send all that in. And they have to keep up with this because yes, it does change. And so you can trust that if somebody's licensed, that they are, as well as we can regulate it, they are up to date and have a pretty good understanding of these disorders. And then the last one, do psychologists have to go through a mental evaluation? How does a person know if their psychologist or psychiatrist is mentally fit to do their job dealing with other people and their emotions? Great question. No. So there are some. So I got my doctorate in counseling psychology, never had to have any kind of mental evaluation directly. I know that there were some programs where you could get your doctorate or master's that required you to be in therapy during your schooling. So you were required to meet with a therapist throughout that. And that would be the closest thing we have to that, is that, those people would have been through therapy. And and those therapists would know, yes, you're in training and you're learning to be a counselor or a therapist. And, so it's important that you understand yourself and your issues. So I think this is a great question because it's not unusual for people to go into the field of counseling or therapy who have had problems themselves. Like it's not uncommon for people who have had addiction issues to go into addiction counseling. A lot of people have really positive experiences with counseling and therapy, and then they want to give back and they want to help other people have those experiences. And so they want to go into counseling. But it is a danger because, and what we refer to it as kind of colloquially within the field is you don't, as a therapist, want to bleed all over your clients. Meaning if you have an injury, a psychological injury, you got to keep that taken care of. You can't be in a session and have your injury bleeding all over somebody else, because then it's hard to tell what's their blood, what's your blood. And that is a very real and important concern. The unfortunate answer is that there's not a very good gatekeeper for that. And it would be really hard to implement anyway, because how would you determine that? Okay, have you met with a therapist? What if the therapist you're meeting with sucks? Like, that's not going to be any help. So part of it is just really left to the consumer, the client, to leave therapists who aren't a good fit. But I've known some therapists who probably shouldn't be doing therapy because they're a little too injured themselves. So it is something that you do have to be on alert for and aware of. The other thing I can say is that training programs, that's part of their job. So when people are getting their degrees, part of those programs is to weed out the people who shouldn't be doing it. So if they find somebody who really seems psychologically unhealthy, they will not let them graduate. And if you don't get the degree, you can't get the license. So that does exist, and that's a help. But that typically, in my experience, will catch typically the worst potential people. The people who just really obviously have some issues. But otherwise, it is kind of left to the therapists themselves to deal with their own issues and make sure they do not get in the way of helping somebody else. And so it's a valid concern. And then one thing I would just say with that is that's why, you want to, when you're seeking a therapist, it's really, really important sometimes to just get referrals. Ask your friends, family, whoever you know. You can ask me. There are different people who might know, and that's how you best find, and you're more likely to find the people who are healthy and avoid the therapists who may be a little less healthy. So some really great questions. And that's the last of our muddiest points. There is no muddiest point for the treatment. But if you do have any questions about that and you're just curious, throw them out to me in an email and I'll get back to you. But otherwise, hopefully this helped understand psychological disorders a little better.